The Russian Federation constantly monitors and documents the facts of both the use and preparation for use by Ukrainian armed formations in the zone of a special military operation of scheduled chemicals, riot control chemicals, and chemicals not included in the control lists of the Chemical Weapons Convention. Since February 2022 year, this information has been repeatedly disseminated in the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, in the Security Council, and the General Assembly of the United Nations, about similar data that indicate the large-scale use of toxic substances by the Kyiv regime, violations of Ukraine's obligations under the Cork, as well as provocations organized by the Kyiv regime, its Western patrons, in order to accusations of the armed forces of the Russian Federation in similar activities. Despite the irrefutability of the information provided by the Russian side, the Ukrainian armed formations continue to systematically use toxic chemicals: chlorine, ammonia, ammonium nitrate, sulfuric acid, including the 2-benzoate and 3-chlorine picrin of the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, as well as the CSIS against units of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, peaceful the population, as well as civil administration officials. What is the reason? This is political patronage and actual approval of such crimes by Washington, Berlin, London, and Paris. In particular, Russian experts recorded violations by the Kyiv regime of the provisions of the Articles of the Core of the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs of 1961 year, the Convention on Psychotropic Substances of 1971 year, and, this is not to mention, the threat of environmental catastrophe, regularly and intentionally created by the armed formations of the Kyiv regime at industrial chemical enterprises of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics of the Russian Federation, as well as in the Sumy, Kharkiv, Odessa regions of Ukraine. The atmosphere of absolute, total impunity created by the so-called collective West literally frees the hands of the Kyiv regime to carry out more large-scale crimes related to the use of toxic chemicals. And we know for sure that the Ukrainian side, with the active assistance of Western states, is planning to commit a series of provocations in the zone of a special military operation. These provocations, as they plan, will be directed against Russia. And they are currently preparing and carrying out a set of measures aimed at falsifying the evidence base, in order to further accuse the Russian Federation of violating the provisions of the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons in the conduct of hostilities. So, according to the Russian competent authorities, in the period from July to September of this year, the NATO parties delivered more than 70 units of modern technical devices to Ukraine, detection and fixation of toxic substances. Among them are the latest detectors for detecting prohibited chemicals and gas analysis tools. At the same time, both in Ukraine and on the basis of the specialized centers of radiation, chemical and biological protection of the countries of the North Atlantic Alliance, training was conducted for employees of law enforcement agencies and special services of Ukraine, worked out on the example of the same Syria and the same Skripal case, as well as in addition to the so-called bulk poisoning by falsifying factual materials and creating the necessary so-called evidence base. Also, the procedure for submitting it to the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons for further accusation, as they always do to Russia, of violating the convention. Part of this activity is carried out by NATO countries through the Technical Secretariat of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and, as we understand, allegedly factual materials fabricated near the line of contact, similar to the stories that took place in Syria, will be transferred to international experts who arrived in Ukraine promptly for compilation. To compile a so-called pseudo-independent report on the fact, of course, of Moscow's far-fetched use of chemical weapons. What is the purpose of this whole action, this whole masquerade? It is understandable. There is no such norm of international law that would stop the NATO parties in their desire to achieve the declared, as they formulate it, strategic defeat of Russia. All the more so when it comes to spent and worked for years, in particular in Syria, in the format of chemical provocations, under a false flag. Moreover, the facts of the close interaction of the Kiev regime with affiliated territorial and national extremist groups, for example, in the Middle East, North Africa, once again convince us that this very chemical terrorism is a very real threat coming from the Ukrainian special services. We warn Washington and its satellites not to play with fire, so as not to completely destroy the regime of the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, built since 1997 year. The Russian Federation continues to inform the international community about violations of the provisions of the Convention by the Kiev regime and about the real state of affairs in the zone of a special military operation. The Russian investigative authorities have documented numerous cases of attempts to poison senior officials of the civil administration, the use of drones equipped with chemicals on various sections of the line of contact. We also provided materials on the discovery of caches with toxic substances that could be used to commit sabotage in various Russian regions. The Russian Federation will continue to record and bring to the attention of the states parties to the Convention on the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and members of the United Nations data on the use of toxic chemicals by the armed formations of the Kiev regime against Russian military personnel, civilians, as well as plans of Ukrainist militants to organize provocations against chemical enterprises of Donbass. The perpetrators of these and other crimes against Russian citizens will be identified and will be punished deservedly and inevitably.